Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Spencer of Columbia University.
Thank you very much. I also make 2 or 3 comments. First, let me begin with the issue of dual identities. I think Qingguo is right. Justin and other scholars, to begin with the reality, China rose to a certain level of development. I really give credit to Xi Jinping's leadership, and also I think the Western countries, Western scholars hadn't paid enough attention to his military reform. He laid off the 300,000 people, and restructured the Chinese defense forces. So I think that I give big credit to him. But my expectation is so high. So I think China's right is still have some kind of it's kind of a Beauty and the Beast story. Have a fantasy or fallacy. So the beauty part we already mentioned a lot. So even in the foreign policy area, I think China, we cannot deny that China contributed more to the UN peacekeeping forces and pay more on these kind of issues, climate change. China done a lot of good things, not only for its own national interest, but also for trying to provide more public goods. But even after a lot of challenges, right? And even I can predict after the 19th Party's Congress, if you study Chinese foreign policies, still a lot of challenges. For example, China will have a border conflict with 6 neighboring countries. It's very difficult for China to build up real partnership network in the world. And on the Belt and Road strategies, I think we need to train more language talents, to know their cultures and politics, So China goes over there not only shouldn't be playing a role as a loner, just you have money and people like you, money doesn't have a color, so people use Chinese loan to build up their facilities, this kind of thing. But as China, you have to calculate political risks. I very much appreciate Mr. Yu mentioned one thing. As a businessman, you feel the opportunity, you just do it. You don't calculate. You don't count on success. You don't know it's successful or not or fail. So that's Belt and Road. Maybe we'll train a lot of talent for China, because right now, as Justin said, about over 8 million people, right? Chinese workers working abroad. I visited Africa. I see young Chinese professionals working with a group of African workers. He's a team leader, so he's building up roads for Tanzania or whatever. So I think this is a lot of opportunities for China. But however, what I really want for scholars in United States, in China, we have to be aware of these risks or challenges ahead. Of another example, the Taiwan issue, that might become a new issue, after Tsai Ing-wen took office, and also the Chinese military is increasingly growing stronger, but you really get negative comments or feedback from the Western media or whatever, a shadow of Chinese military growth. So a growing nationalist sentiments in China, So I think all these things, foreign policies, are more related to domestic politics. And at the 18th Party's Congress, China outlined 2 domestic goals. One is anti-corruption, spend more time do the anti-corruption campaigns, but you see the Michael Guo, his exposure, whatever. I think there's a lot of people in China, live in China, are not aware of this series of that kind of incident, because you don't have access to watch the YouTube, right? To understand real or fake stories. We don't know. We're hard to tell, right? And also, I think in that sense, our panelist, one of the panelists an hour ago, mentioned the transparency things, right? The transparency things, these kind of, I think, things related to democracy, related to human rights, related to the censorship, less censorship or more censorship contribute to economic growth. I think that is critical elements in Chinese, growth model. So another, I think another domestic goal at the 18th Party Congress is environmental control, protection. But however, after 4 or 5 years, the pollution is very heavy in Beijing, in northern China area. So my point is, we gave credit to Chinese economic growth, but we have also to be encouraged, to dare to speak up, to criticize China in the areas that we failed. So that's my first comment, and I hope China, govern yourself better. This is critical for both China and the United States, right, at this critical moment. So that's my first comment. Second comment is talking about the Chinese foreign policy. I think that the 18th Party Congress, China outlined, Xi Jinping outlined a lot of agendas. For example, first agenda is he emphasized 3 functional areas. Number 1 is major power relationship with the United States. Number 2 is, I think he mentioned people-to-people exchange programs, public diplomacy, trying to provide more public goods to the world. A third functional area is about maritime security things, maritime sovereignty things. All these 3 functional areas still existed, right? Still being emphasized. But however, Belt and Road Strategy Initiative took over. Become the top national priority. So that is, I think, one of the change. I think probably even after the 19th Party's Congress, and China will pay more attention to Belt and Road. But that's supposed to be a two-way relationship, right? If you ask, I visited Europe, 2 months ago. Ask some of the European countries, what do you need? What do you can sell to China? So there are a lot of questions, right? And talking about Chinese foreign policy over the last 4 years, China is the biggest loser in Korea crisis, right? China lost South Korea. China lost North Korea. So if you cannot give a fair evaluation, some kind of a review, reconsideration of this Chinese foreign policy in this particular case, some other cases, of Chinese failure, there's no way for China to make more progress. So I think we have to give balanced view on Chinese domestic and foreign policy performance in the last 4 years. I think I ran out of my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now go to questions and answers, and following Walter's precedent, I'm actually going to reserve the right to ask the first question. One of the fascinating things, of course, from the first panel is that Professor Lin laid out a new theory of economic relations, new economics. I've always been curious, Professor Zhao, is there a Chinese theory of international relations? Chinese scholars I know are very conversant with Robert Cohen and Ken Walt and all of that. But I'm curious, is there a Chinese, as China develops its own economic theories, is there a theory of international relations? Who should we pay attention to among, obviously you, but also among your colleagues, with regards to how nations interact with each other?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, we have been debating on whether we need to develop a Chinese theory of international relations. I think theory is supposed to, a good theory is supposed to explain a phenomenon, not just one country, or not just from one country's perspective, okay? But to explain a worldwide phenomenon, and also from a so-called neutral perspective. But of course, there is no complete neutrality or objectivity in academic studies. Somehow, your view are going to be affected by your own situation, your identity, and also your experience, your perspective. So I guess American theory of international relations reflect U.S. Americans' acceptance as well as recreation of theories developed by others, but recreated with the help of Americans' own experience and perception of the existing world. Okay, I think Chinese theory of Chinese contribution to the theory development is to bring in Chinese experience and perceptions, as well as others in history. So in the process, we need to develop a theory that is based on broader experience, more inclusive, and in a way more objective, and more ideological or personally bias neutral. So I don't think we need a theory, a Chinese theory. I think we need a theory that incorporate Chinese experience and reflect the feelings. So in a way, there's a better international theory with probably more objectivity and neutrality by academic standard. Yeah.
Thank you. The floor is now open.
And Professor Jia, you also suggest that China is likely to be more proactive in its foreign policy. Do you see that will be the case with North Korea? And do you expect the aftermath of the 19th Party Congress, China may adjust its approach to North Korea? And if not, what would cause China to make its adjustment? Thank you.
Well, if you look historically, China's position on North Korea, policy on North Korea has changed over time, and together with the discourse, intellectual discourse on whether or how should we approach the North Korean nuclear issue. At the beginning, people were talking about how much should we help North Korea, when we confronted with the North Korean nuclear issue. And later on, as Chinese realize the North Korean nuclear challenge, the debate becomes whether we should help North Korea. Okay. But as North Korea continued to challenge the international community, non-proliferation regime, and also increasingly, Chinese began to realize that North Korea poses a more security threat to China, more as a sort of strategic liability than strategic asset. Okay. So now the question, the debate is how much should we help, how much should we work together with the international community to denuclearize North Korea? Okay. At what price? Okay. I think in the days to come, the policy evolution would continue in that direction. But of course, it has a lot. I mean, if you look at history, the change of Chinese perception has a lot to do with North Korea's own behavior. Okay, I think in the future, North Korea's behavior would continue to shape Chinese policy movement. If it works with the international community on denuclearization through negotiation, then probably China's policy on North Korea would be more moderate, okay? Less sanctions and that sort of thing. But then, if North Korea continue with nuclear tests, then China probably would work more closely with the international community to put greater pressure on North Korea. There are, we have been talking about a lot of ways of putting additional pressure on North Korea, hoping that North Korea can make the right decision. I think China believes strongly that denuclearization is in North Korea's best interest, and China can help North Korea to get a good deal or good bargain if North Korea accept that kind of arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Gao Zhiqin from Asia Policy Plan. I've been receiving Chinese education, wrongly told by Chinese history teachers about this concept of 落后就要挨打, or lagging behind is one vulnerable to attack. And that concept, there's a logic behind that concept that I find is troubling for Chinese concept of peaceful rise, because the logic behind that actually it is okay for you to attack others when you are strong, right? So, how does that explanation kind of make us more convincing when we try to convince the people in the United States that we're going to promote a peaceful rise, or this proactive strategy actually fits into the international order, that we are not promoting a threat? Thank you.
I guess the world has changed. In the old days, you had the kind of a Darwinist kind of a world in which the strong bully the weak. There are leftovers from the old days. And also in the old days, territorial expansion was the only way, in a way, for promoting national for advancing national welfare and prestige. Okay. Now the world has changed. You can do it through trade and working with other countries. Okay. So the U.S. actually started a new model of rise. Okay. Actually, I think the Thucydides trap theory ignore the fact that the U.S. rose in general in a peaceful way, okay, in the 19th century. Actually, the U.S. GDP surpassed that of Great Britain long before the Second World War started. Actually, by the turn of the 1900. But there was never a war between Britain and the U.S., and the hegemonic state and the rising state. And probably, so far we haven't seen any grand strategy on the part of Great Britain to contain and destroy the U.S. chances of becoming the successor of its as a superpower. So the path the U.S. started is something very different from the previous days. In the old days, rising powers conquer territories and become and benefit from it, but the U.S. never, engaged in an active policy of territorial expansion after the Civil War, after it became a so-called after it finished the state building process. And rather, instead of focusing on territorial expansion, it focused on access. Okay? And the U.S. has benefited tremendously from that. Okay? If the U.S. wants a territorial expansion, it would have Mexico a long time ago. It doesn't need to fight a war. All it needs is to destroy the borders. But instead of dismantling the borders, the U.S. is talking about building a wall. So I think China probably China's rise probably would follow this kind of a path. That is, China's rise would focus on access rather than territorial expansion. So that explains why, since the founding of the PRC until now, China has been busy negotiating border agreements with its neighbors, rather than, leaving these territories undefined, and then so that in the future China have good excuses of engaging territorial expansion. I think the world has changed, and there are better ways to advance your interests and protect and develop your prestige than bullying others and engage in territorial expansion.
Can I ruin the mood a little bit for a minute? The U.S. and Britain almost fought a war in 1897 over Venezuela. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to fight. There was quite a debate. Ultimately, in the Thucydides trap, Graham Allison does include the rise of the U.S. as one of the rare success stories. Where I think he's wrong is he attributes it to British accommodation and argues that, therefore, the way to avoid a Thucydides trap is to accommodate a rising power. And I think he misses some of the key historical context. The U.S. and Britain almost came to blows over Venezuela, but Venezuela was not a critical interest for the United Kingdom, for Britain, in 1897. The rise of the United States ultimately allowed Britain to maintain, at a time of shifting power, its core interests around the world. Venezuela was not one. The difference in the Western Pacific is that the U.S.-Japan alliance, to begin with, is an absolute core vital interest defined that way by Kennan and everyone after World War II, and remains the same. First island chain is of critical importance. Taiwan is important. We have allies in the Philippines. So it's a completely different set of interests that are at stake in that regional context. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that Britain had some confidence in the American system of government. It was transparent, but also it was easy to manipulate. And the British diplomats, as I'm sure is still true today, were quite skillful at, maneuvering in America's open and divided system of government, getting members of Congress, different parts of the U.S. government, to support an American foreign policy that was consistent with Britain's interests. But basically, the British knew what was happening in the American debate because it was so transparent. The problem with China today is that under Xi Jinping, the system is becoming more opaque, and I think Dave would agree, not less opaque, and harder to understand. And so I'm not predicting the Thucydides trap. I think it's wrong. I don't think the U.S. and China will fight a war, but I think there are some very significant complications that are quite different from the U.S.-UK case that should make us all think about how hard this is. Not that we'll fight a war, I don't think that, but that we need to learn to be on the right side of history together. I'd put it that way.
Thank you. Excuse me. Dr. Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. Dr. Jha, you described the evolving Chinese foreign policy as kind of an organic, natural evolution of different phases. But you did not mention, and you just said in answer to a previous question, the world has changed. To what extent has the vacuum, the perceived vacuum in U.S. foreign policy invited Chinese adventurism and assertiveness in the South China Sea in particular? Do you see that as having encouraged a change in China's approach to the world because the U.S. is no longer there?
Well, just as Mr. Finkelson said, China is a very pluralistic country in terms of views. There are different people pushing for different views because China's interests are so divided, as I mentioned during the period of transition. Okay, I think. If you ask me, what China should do, okay, China should encourage the U.S. To live up to its responsibilities, okay, to maintain the international order, and China should help the U.S. to maintain the international order. It's our shared interest, okay, and stake. Both China and the U.S. are major beneficiaries of the existing international order. And we have a responsibility as well as stake and interest to help maintain it. Okay. Maintaining international order is a very costly business. Okay. In history, the imperialist powers decline, or hegemonic power decline, according to Paul Kennedy, not because they were defeated by rising powers, but because they were wasted by the burdens of taking care of the international order. Okay. So from the beginning of after the Second World War, the U.S. has tried three things to lower the burden of maintaining the international order. Okay. One is to create a set of, or to maintain this and create a set of alliances, military alliances. Okay. The second is to create the UN-centered international organizations. The third is to develop various kinds of partnerships with other countries, so as to encourage other countries to help pay the cost of maintaining the international order. The U.S. has been quite successful in this regard. Okay. And now the U.S. is saying that I'm not going to play the role of leadership. I'm going to play the role just as another country, trying to take advantage of the international order as a free rider. I think in the short run, the U.S. can benefit because the power, it has so much power, it can have good deals with other countries. But that would happen at the expense of the international order. Okay. I think in the long run, I think all of us are going to pay a price for this. So I think it's not in China's interest at the moment to take over. As I said, to take over the U.S. leadership role, because China does not have the hard power and soft power to do it. China is not ready to take up that kind of responsibility. China probably should help the U.S. to live up to that kind of responsibility. It's in the U.S. interest and it's in China's interest. Maybe at one time, maybe China would grow to the extent that China would have enough soft power and hard power to play the role of leadership. Probably China, even at that time, China would expect the U.S. to help China to help maintain the international order, because it's in the best interest of both of us. Okay. So I'm not seeing our relationship as a sort of zero-sum game. I think our relationship it should be a positive sum game. We should help each other rather than confront each other.
Please join me in thanking the panel for some excellent comments.